Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I always thought Ouija boards were just a joke. You know, something people pull out at sleepovers to freak each other out. Nothing serious. But after what happened last week, I don't know what to believe anymore. And I'm not sure if I'll ever feel safe in my own house again. It started out like any other Friday night. Me, my girlfriend Megan, and our two friends, Kyle and Jason, were hanging out at my place, watching bad horror movies and just trying to kill time. We weren't really paying attention to the TV when Kyle pulled out this beat-up old Ouija board. I don't know where he got it. He said he found it at a yard sale for $1, which should have been a red flag in itself. But we were bored, and I figured it would be fun to mess around with it. Megan wasn't too keen on the idea. She's always been a bit more superstitious, the kind of person who knocks on wood or won't walk under ladders. But Jason and Kyle were all for it, and eventually she gave in. We set the board up on my coffee table, lit a few candles for atmosphere, and sat around it, trying to act like we weren't a little freaked out. Kyle went all out, doing his best spooky voice as he started the session. "Is anyone there?" he asked, with this ridiculous dramatic flair. We all laughed, and for a minute it felt like a joke, just something silly to pass the time. But then the planchette moved. At first I thought Kyle or Jason was messing with us. You always hear about that, right? Someone pushes the planchette just enough to freak everyone out, and it becomes a big laugh. But when I looked up, everyone seemed genuinely surprised, especially Megan, who looked like she was about to bolt from the room. "Who are we talking to?" Jason asked, his voice wavering just a little. The planchette slowly slid to the letters, spelling out a single word. "Watcher." We all stared at each other. I tried to play it cool, making a joke about how we were probably talking to some bored ghost who watches Netflix all day, but no one laughed. The air in the room felt heavier, like someone had turned off all the fans and sucked the oxygen out. I don't know how to explain it, but something shifted in that moment, like we weren't alone anymore. Megan looked visibly uncomfortable. "Maybe we should stop," she suggested, her voice low. But Kyle, being Kyle, was having none of that. "Nah, we're fine. It's probably just a prank spirit or whatever. Let's ask it something else." He placed his fingers back on the planchette. "What do you want?" The planchette moved again, faster this time, spelling out a chilling phrase. "Do not look outside at 3 a.m. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The room was dead silent now, the only sound coming from the flickering of the candle flames. I could see Megan's face pale in the dim light, her eyes wide with unease. Even Kyle looked shaken, though he tried to laugh it off. "Okay, that's creepy," he admitted, "but it's probably just some old urban legend thing. No big deal." Megan wasn't having it. "I don't like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We should stop." But Jason, trying to lighten the mood, added, "Come on. It's not like we're actually going to look outside at 3 a.m. We'll be asleep by then." We decided to end the session right there. I half expected the board to do something dramatic, like fly off the table or catch fire, like you see in the movies. But nothing happened. It was just a board. We said goodbye like you're supposed to, packed it away, and tried to forget about the whole thing. But that warning, "Do not look outside at 3 a.m., stuck with me, and I could tell it was bothering everyone else too. As the night went on, we didn't talk much about what had happened. We tried to act like everything was normal, played some video games, and eventually, Kyle and Jason decided to crash at my place. Megan and I went to bed, but neither of us could sleep. I kept tossing and turning, my mind replaying that warning over and over. The clock on my nightstand blinked 2:45 a.m., 15 minutes until 3. I told myself it was stupid, that nothing would happen, but the thought gnawed at me like a splinter in the back of my mind. What would happen if I looked outside? It was ridiculous, right? Just a game. But the fear crept in, slow and steady, until I couldn't ignore it. At 2:55, Megan finally spoke. "You're not going to look, are you?" Her voice was so quiet, like she didn't even want to ask the question. I shook my head. "Of course not. It's in my head now, you know." She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "It's in mine too." The minutes crawled by, each second ticking louder than the last. I kept glancing at the window, feeling a growing dread, like something was out there, waiting. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to look. But as the clock hit 3 a.m., I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing against the window, but it grew louder, more insistent. Megan froze, her breath hitching as she heard it too. "Don't look," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. But I couldn't help it. Something inside me needed to see. Slowly, I pulled myself out of bed and approached the window. The tapping continued, steady, deliberate, like it knew I was coming. Megan grabbed my arm, her grip tight, but I couldn't stop. I had to know. I pulled the curtain aside, just a crack, and peeked out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. The street was empty, the night still. But then I looked up, and that's when I saw it. Perched on the roof across the street, illuminated by the faint glow of a distant streetlight, was a figure. It was crouched low, its limbs long and twisted, like something that didn't belong in this world. Its eyes were glowing, two piercing orbs of light staring right at me. And its mouth, it was grinning. A slow, impossible grin that stretched far too wide for any human face. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The image of that thing burned into my mind. Megan was wide-eyed, panic in her voice. "What is it? What did you see?" I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "But it's out there, on the roof, watching us." She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The fear in her eyes said it all. And then the tapping started again. But this time, it was coming from above us. Something was on our roof. The tapping continued. At first, it was soft, like the sound of fingernails gently scraping against the ceiling. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, more persistent, as if whatever was up there wanted to make sure we knew it hadn't gone away. Megan gripped my arm so tightly it hurt. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the tapping. I didn't have an answer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. Part of me wanted to run outside, to see what was really up there, but the other part, the part that knew better, wanted to stay hidden under the blankets like a terrified child. And then, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It was oppressive, heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I looked at Megan, her face pale in the dim light. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like something, or someone, was walking across the roof, one measured step at a time. They started above the bedroom and moved toward the hallway, pausing directly above us. My breath caught in my throat. It sounded like whatever was up there was listening, waiting for us to react. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. "We should wake up Kyle and Jason," I whispered, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Maybe they'll know what to do." Megan nodded, her grip loosening just a little, and we both crept out of bed as quietly as we could. Every step felt like it echoed, the sound too loud in the suffocating silence. The footsteps on the roof seemed to follow us, mirroring our movements as we made our way toward the living room where Kyle and Jason had passed out on the couch. When we reached them, I shook Kyle's shoulder gently. "Kyle, wake up!" I hissed. Nothing. He didn't even stir. I shook him harder. "Kyle!" Still nothing. I glanced at Jason, who was sprawled across the other couch, snoring softly. They were both dead to the world, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding around them. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but I shoved it down, trying to think clearly. "We need to get out of here," I muttered, glancing back toward the hallway. The footsteps had stopped again, but I could still feel the presence above us, like a weight pressing down on the roof. "Now!" Megan nodded, already moving toward the front door. I grabbed my keys from the table, my hand trembling, and followed her. The plan was simple. Get out, get in the car, and drive as far away from this house as we could. But as Megan reached for the door, something changed. A shadow moved across the window, fast and deliberate, blocking out the faint light from the street lamp outside. Megan froze, her hand hovering just inches from the doorknob. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I didn't know, but I felt my stomach twist with dread. The shadow hadn't looked like a person. It had moved too quickly, too fluidly, like something slithering just beyond the glass. Megan's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob again, but before she could turn it, we heard a voice. A low, raspy whisper, coming from just outside the door. "Don't open the door." We both froze. My heart felt like it had stopped in my chest. The voice was faint, like it was coming from just beyond the threshold, but it was clear enough. It sounded human, but wrong, like something trying to mimic a human voice but not quite getting it right. Megan took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. I stared at the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The warning from the Ouija board echoed in my head, over and over. "Do not look outside at 3 a.m. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 3:10. "We can't open it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to stay inside." Megan's eyes darted between the door and me, her breathing shallow and panicked. "But what if it gets in?" I didn't know how to answer that. I didn't even know what it was. All I knew was that whatever was out there wasn't human, and it didn't want us to leave. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Open the door!" I backed away, my heart racing. "We need to wake Kyle and Jason," I whispered, grabbing Megan's arm and pulling her toward the living room. "Maybe they'll hear us this time." But as we turned to head back, we froze. Standing in the hallway, just beyond the glow of the kitchen light, was a figure. Tall, thin, with limbs that were far too long for its body. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, glowing white like two dim orbs, were fixed directly on us. Megan let out a choked gasp, backing into me. "What is that?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us with that horrible, crooked grin. The same grin I'd seen on the roof across the street. The same twisted expression that told me this thing wasn't human. And then, as if on cue, it spoke. "I told you not to look." The words were soft, barely a whisper, but they echoed in the stillness, sending a cold wave of fear down my spine. The figure took a slow step forward, its limbs moving with an unnatural grace, almost like it was floating. Megan grabbed my hand, her fingers digging into my skin. "We need to run," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We bolted for the stairs, our footsteps pounding against the hardwood as we scrambled to the second floor. Behind us, I heard the slow, deliberate footsteps of the figure, following us up. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It knew exactly where we were going. We reached my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind us and shoving the dresser in front of it. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. But there was no signal, no way to call for help. Megan sat on the bed, her breathing ragged, tears streaming down her face. "What is happening? Why is this happening?" I didn't know. All I knew was that we'd broken the one rule the Ouija board had given us, and now we were paying the price. the footsteps outside the door stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the roof. It was coming from the window. The tapping was louder now, more insistent, as if it wanted to break through the glass. Each tap felt like a knock directly on my skull, drilling into my mind. Megan was sitting on the bed, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth, trying not to make a sound. I could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just some strange noise or shadow outside. Whatever was tapping, it wanted in. I stood frozen in place, staring at the window, my mind racing. I didn't want to look, but something was pulling me toward it. I felt like if I didn't check, whatever was outside would just keep tapping, growing louder, more aggressive, until it forced me to confront it. "Megan," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." She nodded, her eyes wide and terrified. I could feel her trembling, the fear radiating off her like heat. I didn't know what to do. None of this made any sense. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. I took a step closer to the window. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on my palms as I reached out, ever so slowly, toward the edge of the curtain. I knew I shouldn't look. The Ouija board had warned us. But something inside me was screaming to see what was out there, to face it head on. I hesitated, my hand hovering just inches from the curtain. The tapping stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. My mind was racing, trying to convince myself not to pull the curtain back. I should have listened. But I didn't. In one quick motion, I yanked the curtain aside, expecting to see something, or someone, staring back at me. But the window was empty. No shadows, no figure, nothing but the quiet, dark street outside. For a brief second, I felt relief wash over me, but it didn't last long. As I stared out into the night, something caught my eye. Movement. There, just in the far corner of the yard, by the fence, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a shadow, like someone, or something, sliding out of sight. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting, trying to make out what I'd just seen. It was too dark to tell, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. And then, from directly above me, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse racing. The tapping wasn't coming from outside. It was on the roof. Megan's eyes followed mine, and she let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth again. The footsteps from earlier, the figure in the hallway. Whatever this thing was, it had followed us up here. And now, it was right above us. The ceiling creaked, slow and deliberate, like someone was crawling across the roof, testing every inch of it. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on the room, filling the space with a suffocating sense of dread. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the ceiling, waiting for the next sound. Suddenly, Megan grabbed my arm. "The attic," she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. "There's an attic hatch in the hallway, right?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The attic. It was small, barely more than a crawl space. But it was something. If we could get up there, maybe we could hide, at least until morning. Maybe it wouldn't find us. We moved quickly but quietly, tiptoeing across the room and out into the hallway. The attic hatch was at the far end, just above the linen closet. I could still hear the slow creaking above us, the thing on the roof moving in time with our footsteps. It knew where we were. It was following us. Megan reached the attic first and pulled down the hatch, the ladder unfolding with a soft groan. She climbed up first, her movements quick and desperate. I followed right behind her, glancing over my shoulder as I climbed, half expecting to see the figure from earlier standing at the end of the hallway. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty house. We pulled the ladder up behind us, closing the hatch as quietly as we could. The attic was cold, dusty, and cramped, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the tiny window on the far wall. We huddled together, our backs pressed against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The creaking on the roof stopped, and the house fell into an eerie, unnatural silence. It was almost worse than the noise. The stillness was suffocating, filling the attic with a heavy, oppressive tension. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. We were so close to whatever this thing was. If it knew we were up here, we wouldn't stand a chance. Then, slowly, the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more urgent. And it wasn't just above us anymore. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. It was as if the entire house was alive with that horrible rhythmic sound, closing in on us, surrounding us. Megan clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were trapped, and whatever was out there wasn't going to leave us alone. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. It was like the house was being hammered from all sides, the walls shaking with the force of it. I could feel the floorboards beneath me vibrating, the sound rattling through my bones. It felt like the attic itself was going to collapse, like the entire house was going to come crashing down around us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the stillness suffocating. I didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for whatever came next. And then, from the corner of the attic, I heard it. A soft, raspy voice, barely more than a whisper. "Look." I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. The voice was coming from behind me, from the dark corner of the attic where the light didn't reach. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, my mind screaming at me not to look. But I did. And in the corner, crouched low in the shadows, was the figure. Its eyes glowed, piercing through the darkness, staring right at me. It grinned, that same twisted, unnatural grin, its mouth too wide, too wrong. And in that moment, I realized the truth. It had never been on the roof. It had been in the house with us the whole time. I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the figure crouched in the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on me like it was studying me, waiting for something. Megan hadn't seen it yet. She was still facing the window, trembling, trying to make sense of the sudden silence that followed the endless tapping. I knew that if she turned around, if she saw what was there in the corner, she would lose it. I wanted to scream, to tell her to run, to do something, but my voice wouldn't come. It was like my throat had closed up, my body frozen with fear. All I could do was stare at the thing in the dark and pray it wouldn't move, but it did. The figure shifted, its long limbs unfurling as it stood up, impossibly tall in the cramped space of the attic. It wasn't human, not even close. Its arms were too long, its body too thin, like a shadow stretched into something resembling a person. And that grin, it never wavered, stretching across its face like a grotesque mask. I felt my stomach turn. This thing had been in the house the whole time, watching us. It had been on the roof, in the hallway. It was everywhere. I had no idea how it was doing it, but it was clear now. We were trapped. There was no running from it, no hiding. Megan finally noticed that I wasn't beside her anymore. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression confused at first, and then she saw it. Her eyes widened in horror, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that I knew was threatening to break free. For a moment, we were both frozen, staring at the thing that stood between us and any hope of escape. It took a slow step forward, its body moving with a sickening grace, like it was gliding across the floor. The attic felt smaller, the walls closing in as the figure loomed over us, filling the space with its presence. The air was thick, heavy with dread. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but I was paralyzed. Then the figure spoke again, that same raspy, unnatural voice, like it was struggling to form words. "You looked." Megan's grip tightened on my arm. I could feel her trembling, her breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. The figure took another step forward, its glowing eyes never leaving us. It tilted its head, the grin growing wider, impossibly wider, stretching across its face in a way that made my skin crawl. "Why did you look?" The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. I didn't know how to respond. What could I say? We had broken the one rule the Ouija board had given us. We had looked. And now, whatever this thing was, it was here because of it. It took another step, the floorboards creaking under its weight. I could feel my legs shaking, my body screaming for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The attic was too small, the hatch too far behind us. Even if we could get past the figure, I knew it would catch us before we could get out. "We didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "We didn't know." The figure's grin twisted, its eyes narrowing. "Now, you pay." And then it lunged. The thing moved faster than I thought possible, closing the distance between us in an instant. Megan screamed, finally breaking free of the fear that had held her in place, and we both scrambled backward, pressing ourselves against the far wall of the attic. The figure was inches away now, its twisted face so close I could see the shadows that clung to its skin, the unnatural glow of its eyes burning into mine. I reached for something, anything to defend myself. My hand landed on a rusty old wrench, probably left behind from some forgotten repair job. Without thinking, I swung it with all the strength I could muster, aiming for the figure's head. But it passed right through. There was no impact, no resistance. The wrench sliced through the figure's body like it was made of smoke, dissipating the dark shape for a moment before it reformed, whole again, grinning down at me. My heart sank. Megan grabbed my arm, her voice panicked. "It's not real. It's not real. It can't hurt us." But she was wrong. The figure reached out, its long, shadowy hand extending toward us. I tried to move, tried to pull her back, but the hand was faster. It brushed against her shoulder, just for a second, but that was enough. Megan's scream cut through the air like a knife. I watched in horror as her body convulsed, her eyes wide with pain, her skin paling in an instant. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her shoulder, gasping for breath. I dropped down beside her, grabbing her hand, trying to shake her awake, but her eyes were glazed over, her breathing shallow. "Megan, no! Megan, stay with me!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. But she wasn't responding. Her body went limp, her skin growing cold. I turned back to the figure, anger and terror boiling inside me. "What did you do to her?" The figure stood there, its grin never fading, its voice soft and mocking. "You looked." I wanted to scream, to tear that thing apart, but I couldn't. It was like fighting a shadow, something that wasn't really there, but at the same time was more real than anything I'd ever faced. Suddenly, a new sound broke through the stillness. The tapping. It started again, slow at first, then faster, louder, filling the attic with that horrible rhythm. The walls shook with the force of it, the floorboards trembling beneath me. The figure tilted its head, watching me with those glowing eyes as if waiting for something. And then I realized the tapping wasn't coming from the roof or the walls. It was coming from inside the attic. I looked around frantically, trying to find the source, but it was everywhere, all around me, pounding through my head like a drumbeat. I turned back to Megan, desperate to wake her, to get us both out of there, but something was wrong. Her body. It was changing. Her skin was growing paler by the second, her features twisting, contorting into something that wasn't human. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. Megan. But the thing on the floor wasn't Megan anymore. It looked up at me, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the figure in the corner, its mouth curling into that same impossible grin. The tapping stopped, and then, in a voice that wasn't Megan's, it whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." The thing that used to be Megan stared at me, its eyes glowing in the dark like two burning coals. That grin, that twisted, impossible grin, was the only thing that moved on its face. My mind raced, my thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But it was. I backed up, pressing myself against the far wall of the attic, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure that had been standing in the corner was gone now, but I could feel it, everywhere, like the shadows themselves were alive, watching, waiting. And whatever had happened to Megan, whatever that thing was, it was still here with me. "Megan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I knew it wasn't her, not anymore, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to hear her speak, to know if there was anything left of the person I loved. The thing tilted its head, that grin widening impossibly. It was like it was mocking me, enjoying my fear. Its eyes never blinked, just burned into mine like it could see every secret I'd ever kept, every fear I'd ever had. Then it spoke. "You looked," it rasped, the voice distorted, like multiple voices layered on top of each other. "You looked when you were told not to." My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. There was no fighting this, no escaping it. I was trapped, and the attic felt smaller by the second. The air was thick, suffocating, and the tapping, though faint now, started up again, echoing through the walls. What do you want?" I stammered, barely able to form the words. The thing that had been Megan took a step closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. I pressed myself harder against the wall, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but there was nowhere to go. "I warned you," it said, its voice almost gentle now, as if it were explaining something simple. "The Watcher. We warned you not to look." The Watcher. That word again. The one from the Ouija board. It all came flooding back. The warning, the tapping, the figure on the roof. This thing wasn't just some spirit or shadow. It was something older, something far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. And it had given us a rule we had broken. "You didn't listen," it continued, taking another step closer. "Now you see. Now you understand." I shook my head, my throat dry. Understand what? What is this? What are you? The thing's grin somehow stretched even wider, its eyes glowing brighter. It leaned in closer, its face just inches from mine, and I could feel the cold radiating off it, like standing next to a freezer with the door open. "We are what watches," it whispered. "We are what waits." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't have time to ask. The tapping was louder now, filling the attic, vibrating through the walls. It wasn't just a noise anymore, it was inside my head, a rhythm that synced with my heartbeat, faster and faster. The shadows around us seemed to pulse with it, moving, shifting, like they were alive. The thing that had been Megan reached out, its long, twisted fingers hovering just above my skin. I could feel the cold radiating off it, the chill seeping into my bones. "Now, it's your turn." I felt a jolt of fear so intense that my body finally reacted. I scrambled to my feet, my hands fumbling for the attic hatch. I had to get out, had to escape this thing, whatever it was. My fingers found the latch and I yanked it open, the ladder dropping down with a loud thud. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I climbed down as fast as I could, nearly falling as my feet hit the hallway floor. The house was dark, silent, but I knew I wasn't alone. The thing, the Watcher, it was everywhere. I could feel its presence in the shadows, in the corners of every room, watching me with those glowing eyes. I ran for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest, the tapping still echoing in my mind. The door was locked. Of course, it was locked, but my hands were shaking too much to turn the deadbolt. I cursed under my breath, forcing myself to focus, to steady my hands long enough to turn the lock. As soon as the door clicked open, I threw it wide and ran outside, into the cold night air. For a moment, I thought I was safe. The cool breeze hit my face, and I breathed in deeply, trying to shake the terror that still clung to me like a second skin. I looked around. The street was empty, the houses dark. It felt like the world had gone to sleep while I had been trapped in that nightmare. But then I heard it. That soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me to keep running, I turned around. There, standing on the roof of my house, was the figure. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, that same twisted grin stretching across its face. It raised one long, shadowy hand and pointed at me, its voice carrying across the still night air. "You looked," it whispered, barely audible but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "You will always see." And then it was gone. The figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows like it had never been there. But I knew it wasn't over. It was never going to be over. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't know what to do, where to go. All I knew was that I had looked when I shouldn't have, and now it would always be with me. I don't know what happens next. Maybe it'll leave me alone. Maybe it won't. But one thing is clear. The Watcher is still out there. And it's waiting. Always waiting. I don't know why we did it. I mean, it's not like any of us actually believed in that kind of stuff. UFOs, aliens, all that conspiracy theory junk. But you know how it is when you're bored, hanging out with your friends on a lazy weekend, and someone throws out a dumb idea. That's exactly what happened when me, Ben, Sarah, and Jordan found ourselves sitting in my basement with a dusty old Ouija board one Saturday night. It started out harmless. We were just trying to kill time. Ben had picked up the board from a garage sale a few weeks back as a joke. And since there was nothing better to do, we figured, why not? It seemed like fun, something to laugh about later. But now, thinking back on it, I can't help but feel like we should have known better, like we should have left it alone. See, the thing is, our town has a history of strange UFO sightings. It's one of those small, quiet places where nothing much happens, except for the occasional whisper about lights in the sky or people going missing for a few hours with no memory of where they'd been. I'd always brushed it off as nonsense, something locals made up to make life more interesting. But Sarah, who'd been reading way too many UFO blogs lately, was obsessed. So when we sat down around the Ouija board, the candles flickering around us, she was the one who suggested it. Let's ask about the UFOs. We all laughed, but there was something about the way the air seemed to grow heavier that made me hesitate. I don't know if it was the dim lighting or the cold draft sneaking in from somewhere, but it felt off. Still, we went along with it. Ben, being the sarcastic jerk he always is, grinned and said, "All right, let's see what the aliens have to say." He placed his fingers on the planchette, and the rest of us followed, barely holding back our laughter. "Is anyone out there?" Sarah asked, in her most dramatic, ghost hunter voice. Nothing happened, obviously. We all waited for the planchette to move, but it just sat there, motionless, on the board. I was about to make a joke when Jordan, who had been quiet the whole time, leaned in closer. "Seriously, let's ask. I've heard some weird stuff lately about the sightings. What's the worst that could happen?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. It was supposed to be a joke, just something to pass the time. But the way he said it, I don't know, It sent a chill down my spine. Still, I didn't want to be the one to back out, so I kept my fingers on the planchette as Sarah asked the question. Are the UFO sightings in our town real? We waited. For a long time, there was nothing. The only sound was the soft flicker of the candles and the faint hum of the basement's old radiator. I remember thinking how dumb it was, how we were wasting time sitting around an old board game. But then the planchette moved. At first, it was subtle, like a gentle nudge. I figured one of them was messing with us, so I shot Ben a look, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. None of us were moving it. I could feel the tension in the room build as the planchette slid across the board, slowly, deliberately. It spelled out, yes. My heart pounded in my chest. Sarah's voice shook as she asked the next question. What are they doing here? The planchette moved faster this time, like something was guiding it with purpose. It spelled out one word, watching. I swear, the room felt colder after that. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I looked around at my friends, expecting someone to laugh or call it out as a prank, but no one did. We all just sat there, frozen, staring at the board. We should stop, I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked. This is getting weird. But Sarah wasn't done. She leaned in even closer, her eyes wide with curiosity. Where can we find them? The planchette paused for a second, like whatever was controlling it was thinking. Then it moved again, slower this time, more deliberate. It spelled out, look up. We all sat in stunned silence. No one said anything, but I could tell by the look on everyone's faces that we were all thinking the same thing. What the hell had we just done? I think we should stop, Ben said quietly, his usual bravado completely gone. This isn't funny anymore. For once, I agreed with him. I didn't care if it was all a joke or someone's idea of a prank. There was something about that last message that hit too close to home. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like we'd crossed a line we weren't supposed to. We packed up the board quickly, all of us a little shaken but trying to play it cool. I remember Sarah making a joke about how it was probably just our imaginations, but her voice was tense, and she didn't look anyone in the eye. We didn't talk much after that. Everyone just kind of went home, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But later that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the planchette spelling out those words. Yes, watching, look up. Out of pure instinct, I found myself looking out the window, and that's when I saw it. A flash of light, just above the trees in the distance. At first, I thought it was a plane, maybe a helicopter, but it didn't move like anything I'd ever seen before. It hovered there, completely still, too bright and too low to be any kind of aircraft. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I sat there, heart racing, staring into the night, half expecting it to come back. But it didn't. Not then, at least. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination running wild after what had happened with the Ouija board. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. The next day, I tried to forget about what had happened. I mean, how could I not? It was just a dumb game we played in the basement, right? But that light I saw out my window kept creeping into my thoughts. I tried convincing myself it was just a plane, maybe a drone, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something I didn't want to understand. I didn't bring it up with anyone, not Ben, not Sarah, not Jordan. It felt too weird, and honestly, I didn't want them to think I was losing it. But as the day dragged on, I noticed something strange. None of them were reaching out either. By late afternoon, I caved and texted Ben. Yo, you good? That stuff last night was crazy. I threw in a laughing emoji to make it seem like I wasn't still thinking about it. No response. Weird, but not alarming. Ben had a habit of ghosting people for days at a time. I figured he was just being his usual self. Next, I hit up Sarah. Same thing. No reply. Now that was strange. Sarah wasn't the type to ignore messages. She always responded, even if it was just to send a meme or some random TikTok. Still, I didn't think much of it. People get busy, but then Jordan texted me first. It was a short, shaky message. "Have you seen anything weird today?" My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "What do you mean by weird? You're not talking about last night, right?" The 3 little dots popped up, then disappeared, then came back, then disappeared again. It was like he didn't know how to say what he was thinking. Finally, he sent a voice note instead. I hit play, and his voice came through, low and tense. "I'm probably just being paranoid, but dude, I saw lights again. Same ones we talked about last night. It was around noon, super bright, just hanging there in the sky, not moving. I didn't even tell anyone. What if it's real?" My skin prickled. This wasn't like Jordan. He was the skeptic, the one who never bought into the supernatural stuff. For him to admit seeing something was enough to get my heart racing. But I couldn't freak out, not yet. I told myself it was just a coincidence. He was probably just jumpy because of what we did with the Ouija board. That had to be it. I typed back, "It's probably nothing, man. Let's meet up tonight and talk about it. Maybe get the others too." His response was instant. "Not a good idea. I think someone's watching me. I'm not leaving the house." Now, that was a red flag. Jordan didn't get scared easily. Something had him genuinely freaked out. I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up, and that only made the knot in my stomach tighten. I stared at my phone for a while, wondering what the hell was going on. That's when Sarah called. Her voice was panicked, cutting straight through the silence of my room. "Jake, you need to come over right now." "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my mind was racing. "Did you see something too?" "It's not just lights," she said, her breath coming in short gasps. There's something in the field behind my house. It's been there all day. I thought it was just a shadow, but it keeps getting closer." I didn't even think twice. I grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and told her I was on my way. The whole drive to her place felt like a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of what I was about to find. Lights? Shadows? Were we losing it? Was this some mass hysteria after messing with that Ouija board? It didn't feel real, but then again, everything about this felt wrong. When I pulled up to Sarah's place, it was already getting dark. She lived on the edge of town, where the houses thinned out and the woods started creeping in. I parked in her driveway and ran to the front door, banging on it until she finally opened it, her face pale and drawn. "Come inside," she whispered, grabbing my arm and pulling me in. "I don't want them to see you." "Who?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she led me through the house and out to the back porch, where her yard opened up to a huge empty field that stretched toward the tree line. The air was still, too still, like everything was holding its breath. And then I saw what she was talking about. At first, it just looked like a shadow, something dark and tall standing in the middle of the field. It wasn't moving, just standing there, like it was watching. It took me a second to realize how tall it was, taller than any person should be. It didn't make sense, the way it blended into the darkness like that. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, taking a step back. Sarah gripped my arm tighter. "It's been there since this morning. I thought it was just some trick of the light, but it's real. It's watching the house, Jake. Every time I look away, it gets closer." I squinted into the fading light, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But it was there, undeniably there. "Have you called anyone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "Who am I supposed to call? The cops? What am I supposed to tell them? That a shadow is stalking me? They'll think I'm crazy." I didn't have a response. Part of me wanted to run back to the car and get the hell out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot, staring at the shadowy figure in the field. My mind flashed back to the Ouija board, to the message we got. Watching. Was this it? Was this what it meant? Before I could say anything else, the lights came back. This time, they were closer. Bright orbs hovering just above the trees at the edge of the field, glowing with an unnatural light that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. They flickered, pulsing in a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost like they were signaling something. "They're everywhere," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ever since last night, they won't stop." We stood there, watching the lights grow brighter, the figure in the field still unmoving. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt real fear. Not the kind you get from watching a horror movie or telling ghost stories. This was different. This was real. "Let's go back inside," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We need to figure out what's going on." But even as we retreated back into the house, locking the door behind us, I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. We'd opened something we shouldn't have, and now it was everywhere. That night at Sarah's place was when everything started to unravel. After we went back inside, we tried to pretend that nothing was wrong. We locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat in her living room with the TV on, just trying to ignore the creeping fear outside. But neither of us could stop glancing at the windows, even though they were covered. The lights, the shadow in the field, it was all still out there, waiting. Sarah was jittery, pacing back and forth, her fingers trembling as she clutched her phone. I sat on the couch, my mind spinning, trying to figure out what we could do next. Calling the cops seemed pointless. What would we even say? There was no way they'd believe us. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But then, around 11 p.m, Sarah's phone buzzed. She jumped like she'd been shocked. I watched her glance down at the screen, and her face paled even more. "It's from Ben," she whispered, her voice shaky. "What does it say?" She swallowed hard, then read the message out loud. "Get out. They're inside." For a second, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. My mind raced. Inside. What the hell did that mean? Was Ben talking about his place? Was he in danger? Or did he mean something else? Before I could ask her anything, another message came through. This time, Sarah didn't read it out loud. She just stared at the screen, her eyes wide with fear. I leaned over to look and felt my heart drop into my stomach. The message was just a single image, a blurry photo, but it was clear enough to see what it was. It was us, sitting in Sarah's living room, right now. "Who took that?" I whispered, my throat tightening. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "But it just came from Ben's number." I shot up from the couch, adrenaline surging through me. I started checking the doors, making sure everything was locked, while Sarah frantically dialed Ben's number, but no one answered. Just the monotonous beep of his voicemail. "Something's wrong," she muttered, pacing again. "Ben wouldn't just mess with us like this. He's not that kind of guy." I nodded, though my mind was racing in 1,000 directions. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, really watched. Like whoever or whatever had sent that message was just outside, waiting for us to make the next move. And then the TV flickered. At first, I thought it was just static, but then the screen flashed to something else. A grainy black and white image of the field behind Sarah's house, the same field where we'd seen the shadow. I froze, watching as the camera panned slowly, almost like it was being controlled remotely. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but the figure, the shadow, was gone. The camera kept moving, inching closer to Sarah's house, until it reached her back porch. My breath caught in my throat as the screen zoomed in on the back door. It was locked, just like we'd left it. But then something moved. A figure stepped into the frame, tall, thin, with a face I couldn't make out. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, coming right up to the door, almost as if it knew we were watching. "Turn it off," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Turn it off now." I scrambled for the remote, my fingers fumbling with the buttons, but the image wouldn't disappear. The figure on the screen reached out, tapping on the glass of the door. The sound faint but distinct. Tap, tap, tap. Sarah bolted from the room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she ran toward the kitchen. I followed, but the tapping continued, louder now, more insistent. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to run, but I didn't know where to go. "Is there a back way out of here?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "No, just the front." Another tap, this time louder. We stood there, frozen, neither of us daring to move. The sound felt like it was coming from everywhere, echoing in my skull. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat trickling down the back of my neck. Whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving, and I had no idea what it wanted. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence felt deafening. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for the next move, but nothing happened. No more tapping, no more sounds from outside. I think it's gone," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Sarah nodded, but she didn't move from where she was standing. We stood like that for what felt like forever, staring at the back door, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the house remained still. The lights outside had vanished. The figure on the screen hadn't come back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I grabbed my phone and pulled up Ben's number, trying him again. Still nothing. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we can't stay here. Not after that." She nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "Where can we go? What if they're everywhere?" I didn't have an answer. Every part of me wanted to get in the car and drive as far away as possible, but I had a gut feeling that wherever we went, whatever this was, it would follow us. Still, staying here wasn't an option. "We need to find Jordan," I said finally. "Maybe he knows something." Sarah looked at me like I was crazy, but she didn't argue. I grabbed my keys and we headed for the door, moving quickly, trying to avoid looking out any of the windows. The sense of being watched had grown unbearable. I felt it crawling on my skin, even though there was no one there. No lights, no figures, just the overwhelming, suffocating sensation that we weren't alone. As we stepped outside, I expected the worst. Something waiting for us in the shadows, but the driveway was empty. The street was quiet. It almost felt normal, until my phone buzzed again. I glanced down, and my blood ran cold. Another message, this one from a blocked number. "We see you." I didn't wait to read it aloud. I just grabbed Sarah's arm and we ran to the car, my heart pounding in my chest, fear driving every step. We had to find Jordan. We had to get answers. But deep down, I knew that whatever we'd messed with, whatever we'd unleashed, it was already too late to stop it. We sped through the empty streets, the lights of Sarah's house vanishing behind us as we raced toward Jordan's place. The whole time, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the lights again, or worse, something following us. But the road stayed dark and still, just the quiet hum of the engine and the sound of our own panicked breathing filling the car. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We were both running on pure adrenaline, every muscle in my body tense as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind was racing, going over every weird, terrifying thing that had happened since we touched that damn Ouija board. It felt like whatever was out there had been watching us the whole time, waiting for us to mess up. And now, it wasn't just watching. It was here. Sarah was fidgeting with her phone, checking it over and over like she expected some kind of answer to pop up. "What if they got to Jordan already?" she whispered, barely audible over the hum of the car. I didn't respond. I didn't want to think about that possibility. Jordan hadn't answered his phone since he sent that weird voice message earlier. We were driving into this blind, not knowing what we'd find when we got there. As we pulled onto Jordan's street, my gut twisted. The houses were dark, too quiet, like everyone had just disappeared. I parked a few houses down from Jordan's, not wanting to get too close. Something about the way his house looked under the pale glow of the streetlights made me uneasy. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar. Sarah gripped my arm. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't go in." But we didn't have a choice. We had to know what was happening. "Stay close," I whispered, opening the car door. "If something's off, we're getting out of here. No hesitation." She nodded, and we moved together, creeping toward the front of Jordan's house like we were walking into a trap. The front yard was empty, but the air felt heavy, like something was lurking just beyond the edges of our vision. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as we reached the door. I nudged it open with my foot, the door creaking as it swung inward. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The lights were off, but I could just make out the shapes of furniture in the living room, untouched, like Jordan had been here earlier. But something stopped him from leaving. "Jordan!" I called softly, stepping inside. No response. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet as we made our way through the house. I glanced over at Sarah, who was clutching her phone so tightly I thought she might break it. "Do you think he left?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I muttered, checking the hallway. "But something feels—" I stopped mid-sentence. There was a light coming from the kitchen, a faint glow that wasn't there a moment ago. I glanced back at Sarah, who shook her head, fear etched across her face. We moved slowly toward the light, the glow growing brighter as we got closer. As we reached the kitchen doorway, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the kitchen table, was a laptop, Jordan's laptop. The screen was open, displaying a video feed. But it wasn't any normal video feed. It was us, a live camera feed of Sarah and me, standing in his kitchen just moments before. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away from the screen. Sarah moved closer, staring at the video in horror. How is this possible? Who's recording us?" Before I could answer, the screen flickered. The camera feed shifted to outside, focusing on the street right in front of the house, the street where we'd parked. My blood ran cold. There, on the screen, were two dark figures standing beside my car, their faces obscured by the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, like they were waiting. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now." We didn't waste another second. We bolted out of the kitchen, heading for the front door as fast as we could. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as we reached the entryway, something stopped me dead in my tracks. The door slammed shut on its own. Sarah let out a stifled scream, her hands trembling as she grabbed at the doorknob, trying to pull it open. But it wouldn't budge. It was like the house itself was working against us, trapping us inside. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to think of another way out. Then, from the darkness behind us, came a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping, just like the tapping we'd heard at Sarah's house. My stomach dropped. We turned slowly, our backs pressed against the door, staring into the darkened hallway. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall, thin, with no discernible face, just a dark, looming presence moving toward us with that same deliberate, inhuman slowness. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every instinct I had screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. The figure stopped in the middle of the hallway, standing there in perfect stillness, as if waiting for something. The tapping sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the empty house. And then, without warning, the lights flickered on, flooding the house with a cold, sterile glow. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my vision adjusting as I looked at the figure again. It was gone. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her whole body trembling. "What the hell is happening?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Another message, this one from Jordan's number. "They're inside. You can't escape." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The figure might have disappeared, but I knew it wasn't over. This wasn't something we could just run from. Whatever this was, whatever we'd awakened, it had followed us here, and it wasn't going to stop. "We need to find Jordan," I said, my voice barely steady. "He has to know something we're missing." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it. Jordan had warned us, told us to stay away, to stop. But we hadn't listened, and now it was too late. And then the front door creaked open, slowly, on its own. We didn't think. We just ran. Out into the night, away from the house, away from the figures, away from the unseen watchers who were always one step ahead. But no matter how far we ran, no matter where we went, I could feel it. The weight of their eyes on us. The constant, suffocating presence lurking just out of sight. We could run all we wanted, but there was nowhere to hide. They were everywhere. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear pulsing through my veins kept me moving. Sarah was right behind me, her breathing ragged, eyes wide with terror. It didn't matter how fast or how far we ran. I could feel it in the air, their presence. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. We found ourselves at an old gas station on the outskirts of town. The flickering neon sign barely lit up the parking lot, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. It was late, the kind of late where everything feels like a dream or a nightmare. The streets were empty, but even in the stillness, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being followed. We huddled inside the gas station, taking refuge under the dim fluorescent lights, catching our breath. The clerk behind the counter glanced at us with mild suspicion, but he didn't say anything. He was half asleep, probably just waiting for his shift to end. I was about to ask him if he'd seen anything strange around town lately, if anyone else had come running in terrified like we had, but I stopped myself. What could I even say? How do you explain this? Sarah sank into a plastic chair near the counter, her face pale, her hands shaking uncontrollably. What are we going to do?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, like she was barely holding it together. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we can't stay here." I pulled out my phone, hoping to find a message from Jordan, some clue that he was still out there. But there was nothing. The last message I'd gotten, the one warning us that we couldn't escape, was burned into my brain. No missed calls, no new texts, just silence. "What if Jordan's gone?" Sarah said, breaking the quiet. "What if they got him?" I didn't have an answer for her. I wanted to believe he was still out there, that he had answers we hadn't figured out yet. But the truth, deep down, I knew he was probably gone. Just like Ben. Just like we would be soon. Suddenly, the gas station door creaked open. Both Sarah and I jumped, our nerves shot. But it wasn't the men in black suits or some shadowy figure looming in the doorway. It was just a guy, maybe in his 40s, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel jacket. He didn't even look at us, just walked over to the cooler, grabbed a drink, and paid the clerk. He walked out without saying a word, the door clanging shut behind him. But something about the way he moved, the way he didn't even acknowledge us, set me on edge. It felt wrong. It felt too normal, like he didn't even see us there. My paranoia was eating me alive. Was he one of them? Or was I just losing it? "We need to leave," I muttered, more to myself than to Sarah. This place isn't safe." Before she could respond, my phone buzzed again. I froze, dread coursing through me. Slowly, I pulled it out of my pocket, already knowing it wasn't good. Another message, this time from an unknown number. "Final warning, stop or disappear." I felt my stomach churn. My hands trembled as I showed the message to Sarah, her eyes widening in terror. We were out of options. They were closing in. I could feel it in my bones. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. This was it. "We need to find Jordan's laptop," I said suddenly, the idea hitting me like a jolt of electricity. He was onto something. There were files. Maybe there's something in there that can help us. Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Go back. Are you insane? We barely got out of there." "I know, but what if that's the only way? What if the answers are in those files?" I was grasping at straws, but it was all we had left. I couldn't just sit here waiting for them to find us. We had to do something. Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. "Okay, but if we see them again, we leave, no matter what." We left the gas station and headed back toward Jordan's neighborhood, every nerve in my body on high alert. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight or the distant sound of a car. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. When we reached Jordan's house, it looked exactly as we'd left it. Dark, empty, ominous. The door was still slightly ajar, creaking in the cold night air. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but we didn't have a choice. We stepped inside, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. The house felt colder, more oppressive than before. I could feel the presence again, watching us from the shadows, but I pushed the fear down, focusing on one thing: finding that laptop. We made our way back to the kitchen, where we'd left the laptop earlier. It was still there, the screen dark but alive, like it had been waiting for us to return. I opened it up, my hands shaking, and quickly searched through the files. Most of them were encrypted, but one folder stood out: Project Observer. I clicked on it, the screen filling with documents, images, video files. It was a detailed report on some kind of surveillance program, one that had been running in our town for years. The lights, the figures, the disappearances. It was all connected. They weren't just watching us. They were controlling us, experimenting. "They're using the sightings as a cover," I muttered, piecing it together as I scrolled through the documents. "They make people think they're seeing UFOs, but it's just them. They're manipulating everything." Sarah was reading over my shoulder, her breath hitching as she saw the images. Blurry photos of lights in the sky, shadows lurking in fields. And then, the worst one, a picture of us. The four of us from the night we'd used the Ouija board. Taken from some kind of surveillance camera, the timestamp marking it as the exact moment we'd asked about the UFOs. "They've been watching us since the beginning," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We never stood a chance." Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the house. We froze, our eyes darting toward the hallway. Another thud, this time closer. My heart raced, every muscle in my body tensing as I realized what was happening. They were here. "We need to go," Sarah whispered, backing away from the laptop. "Now." But before we could move, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The air grew thick, oppressive. I could feel them, closing in on us, cutting off every escape. The lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. There was nowhere left to run. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as we backed into the kitchen, the weight of the darkness pressing down on us. And then, from the shadows, they appeared. The figures, tall, thin, faceless, moving toward us with that same slow, deliberate pace. They didn't need to rush. They knew we were trapped. I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The fear had locked me in place, my mind screaming as the figures drew closer. Sarah was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. But she didn't move either. We were frozen, helpless, as they surrounded us. And then the lights went out. Total darkness. Total silence. The last thing I remember before everything went black was a voice, low and cold, echoing through the room. "You were warned." I woke up alone. The house was empty. No sign of Sarah. No sign of Jordan. Everything was normal. But I knew it wasn't. They'd erased everything. Everyone. I checked my phone. No messages, no calls, nothing. It was like none of it had ever happened. But I know better. They're still watching. And I'm next. It all started as a stupid, innocent game. You know how it is. You get a few friends together, hang out, and someone inevitably brings up the idea of doing something creepy. It was a Friday night, and my roommate, Ben, had just moved into our new apartment. We invited a few people over to celebrate, have some drinks, and break in the place. After a few hours, when the buzz from the drinks started to settle in and the conversations slowed, it was our friend Tara who pulled out the Ouija board. I hadn't even noticed her bring it in, but there it was, sitting in the middle of the coffee table like some cursed relic we weren't supposed to touch. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. I'm not superstitious, but Ouija boards always gave me this weird, uncomfortable vibe. It's not that I believe they actually work or anything. It's just, why tempt fate? "Come on, Jason," Tara teased, lighting a few candles and dimming the lights. "It'll be fun. Let's see if we can talk to someone." Ben was into it immediately. He loved anything that gave him a thrill, so of course he was game. "Let's do it. What's the worst that could happen?" That line. I wish he hadn't said that. There were 5 of us, Ben, Tara, me, and 2 others, Sarah and Ethan. We all sat around the board, fingers lightly resting on the planchette. I didn't want to do it, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill either. So, I played along. Tara started with the usual. "Is there anyone here with us?" Her voice was dramatic, dripping with fake anticipation. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Just the usual nervous giggles and people accusing each other of trying to push the planchette. But then, after what felt like forever, the thing started moving. Slowly. Deliberately. None of us spoke as the planchette spelled out letters. "THERE," Sarah read out loud, her voice shaking a little. "There," Ben laughed. "Okay, maybe one of you is screwing with us. Let's get real." But before he could finish, the planchette moved again, faster this time. "MATCH," Ethan said. "There. Match?" I shrugged. "Maybe it's just random letters. Can't expect ghosts to be good at spelling." We all laughed, trying to shake off the weird feeling in the room. But that laugh died in our throats when the planchette jerked violently, sliding across the board in quick, precise movements. I couldn't explain it. It was like someone else was controlling it. The letters came quickly this time, so fast we had to keep up. 1-9-2, Tara whispered as the numbers appeared. Then 1-6-8. And that's when it hit me. My stomach dropped. "Stop," I said, pulling my hand away. My heart was pounding, and the laughter from earlier was gone. "What is it?" Ben asked, confused. Everyone looked at me, expecting me to explain why I suddenly freaked out. But I didn't want to say it. I didn't want it to be real. "Those numbers," I said quietly. "They're an IP address." Ethan blinked, confused. "What, like for a computer?" "Yeah," I muttered, suddenly feeling nauseous. "My IP address." The room fell dead silent. No one moved. No one laughed. We all just stared at each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Ben broke the silence. "Okay, someone's screwing with you, man. There's no way that's your actual IP address." But it was. I knew it. I had seen it enough times, checking my router settings or troubleshooting our Wi-Fi. It was my IP address, and I couldn't figure out how in the world a Ouija board, this dumb $10 toy, had spelled it out. Tara laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Maybe your computer's haunted, Jason. I didn't respond. Something about this felt wrong, really wrong. I grabbed my phone, quickly checking my network settings. My heart sank when I saw the same numbers staring back at me from the screen. 192.168.0.1. Exactly what the board had spelled out. Guys, I don't know what's going on, but I'm done with this, I said, standing up. I was trying to play it cool, but my hands were shaking. I could feel my skin crawling, the sense that something was watching us. I needed to get out of there. The whole vibe of the night had shifted. What started as a joke now felt dangerous. Ben stood up with me, but before he could say anything, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was just a series of numbers and symbols, like random code, but it didn't take me long to figure out what it meant. It was my IP address again, but this time it was followed by a single word. Found. My chest tightened, and I showed it to the group. No one knew what to say. Ben's face had gone pale, and even Tara, who had been laughing it off just moments before, looked genuinely freaked out. Who sent that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. None of us knew. And that was the scariest part. Let's shut this down, I said, grabbing the Ouija board and tossing it into the closet. But I knew it wasn't the board. It wasn't the game. Whatever had just happened, it was already too late to stop. That night, after everyone left, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, staring at my phone, waiting for another message. But none came. The house felt different now, like it wasn't mine anymore, like someone, or something, had gotten inside. I kept checking my windows, my doors, making sure everything was locked. But no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't matter. The danger wasn't outside. It was already here. It had found me. I spent hours trying to convince myself it was a prank, maybe Ben or Ethan messing with me. But that didn't make sense. They didn't have the technical skills to hack my IP address or send cryptic messages like that. No, this was something else, something darker. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I heard a noise. Faint, but there. A tapping sound, like someone lightly knocking on the window. My heart raced as I sat up, listening. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a tree branch. The tapping was deliberate, rhythmic. I didn't check. I didn't look. I just lay there, too terrified to move. Somewhere, deep in the back of my mind, I knew. Whoever had found my IP address. They were closer than I thought. The next morning felt off. I woke up groggy, like I hadn't really slept, even though I hadn't moved an inch since that tapping sound. It was probably nothing, right? My mind playing tricks on me after the weirdness with the Ouija board. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I dragged myself out of bed and checked my phone. No new messages, no weird notifications. For a second, I felt relief. Maybe it really had been just a bad dream. But then I saw it. In my browser history, there was a page I didn't recognize. A dark web link. My blood ran cold as I stared at the string of random letters and numbers that made up the URL. I knew for a fact I hadn't gone to any sketchy websites. I wasn't the type to mess around on the dark web. But there it was, like a beacon, sitting at the top of my history. My stomach twisted into knots. How had it gotten there? I clicked on it, half expecting a 404 error or a broken page. Instead, I was met with a forum, one of those old-school bare-bones pages with no design, just black text on a white background. The title at the top of the page sent a shiver through me. We see you. Underneath were hundreds of posts, all by anonymous users, some filled with gibberish, others with cryptic messages about watching, listening, tracking. I quickly closed the tab, heart pounding in my chest. This was getting way too real. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a virus or some random malware had opened the page without me realizing it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. but that feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I could feel eyes on me, even though I was alone in the room. I texted Ben and Tara, telling them about the strange link and the dark web forum. Tara replied almost immediately, "What the hell? That's creepy as fuck." "Maybe it's just a hacker or something," Ben chimed in. "Change your passwords, man. You'll be fine." They weren't getting it. This wasn't just some hacker. Whoever had sent me that text knew my IP address. They were messing with me, deliberately. And now, they had me looking at dark web forums I wanted no part of. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus. Every time I checked my phone, I half expected another message. Every time my laptop dinged, my heart skipped a beat. I changed all my passwords like Ben had suggested, reset my router, and did a full sweep of my computer, but nothing seemed to help. That uneasy feeling stayed with me, growing worse as the day went on. That night, Ben and I were sitting on the couch, watching TV, trying to distract ourselves from what had happened. We didn't talk about the Ouija board or the weird IP address incident. It was like we had silently agreed not to bring it up. Around 11 p.m, there was a knock on the door. I froze, staring at Ben, who looked just as confused as I felt. "Are you expecting anyone?" I asked. He shook his head. "Are you?" I wasn't. We weren't the kind of people who had random visitors, especially not this late. The knock came again, louder this time. "Maybe it's the neighbours," Ben said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. He stood up and walked over to the door, peeking through the peephole. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back from the door. "What? Who is it?" "There's no one there." Another knock. This time, it wasn't from the door. It was from the window. A slow, deliberate tap, just like the one I had heard the night before. I turned toward the window, dread building in my chest. The blinds were closed, but I could see a faint outline, a shadowy figure standing on the other side. My mouth went dry. "Ben," I whispered. "Someone's out there." He glanced at the window, and I saw the colour drain from his face. "Dude, we need to call the cops." But before either of us could move, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. "Open the door." I stared at the message, my mind racing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I showed the text to Ben, and his eyes widened. "No way, man," he whispered. "This is insane. We're not opening that door." But the knocking continued, first at the door, then at the window, back and forth, rhythmic, like someone was toying with us. My hands shook as I texted back. "Who are you? What do you want?" There was no immediate reply, just the relentless knocking. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was outside was waiting for us to crack, to make a move. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out how this could be happening. Was it someone messing with us? A hacker? A prank? But why would they go this far? Suddenly Ben's phone buzzed. He looked down at it, and his face went pale. "It's from the same number," he muttered, showing me the message. "We know where you are. Let us in." I backed away from the window, my skin crawling. This wasn't just some hacker. This was someone here, right outside our door, and they knew exactly where we were. Ben rushed to lock the door, double-checking the deadbolt, but the knocking didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more aggressive. "We should call the cops," I whispered, feeling like we were being watched from every corner of the apartment. Ben nodded, fumbling with his phone as he dialed 911, but just as he hit call, the line went dead. No dial tone, nothing. My phone buzzed again. "Calling won't help. We're already inside." My heart nearly stopped. I stared at the message, my hands trembling so hard I almost dropped my phone. Inside? That wasn't possible. We had locked everything. There was no way someone could be inside the apartment. But as I looked around the room, that sinking feeling of dread intensified. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone, that somehow, whoever was doing this had already gotten in. Ben backed away from the door, his face white as a sheet. "Jason, what the hell do we do?" Before I could answer, there was another knock. This time, it wasn't from the door or the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. Ben and I both froze, our eyes darting toward the hallway. The knocking continued, slow, deliberate, coming from the closet at the end of the hall. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, staring at the closet door, the faint sound of tapping echoing through the apartment. I didn't know what was behind that door, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But one thing was clear. We weren't alone anymore. The tapping from the closet door seemed to stretch time, each knock hitting me like a jolt of electricity. Neither Ben nor I spoke as we stood frozen, staring at the source of the sound. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. No movement, no noise, except for that slow, deliberate knocking. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The messages, the dark web forum, the IP address, none of it seemed real anymore. It was like we had stepped into a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. Ben took a step toward the closet. "Don't," I whispered, grabbing his arm. My voice was barely audible, more a breath than an actual sound. "We need to know what's going on," Ben muttered, but his voice was shaky. He didn't sound convinced. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Neither of us moved, but the oppressive weight of something unseen filled the room. I could feel it. Something watching us, waiting for us to make the next move. My phone buzzed, and the vibration was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. I nearly dropped it as I scrambled to see the message. My stomach twisted as I read the words. "Open the closet. You need to see." I showed the message to Ben, my heart racing. "What do we do? This isn't a joke anymore." Ben stared at the closet door, his face pale, his hands trembling. "If someone's in there, they'd have to be messing with us, right? Like hiding or something." But even as he said it, we both knew that wasn't the case. We had been in and out of that closet all week, unpacking, moving things around. It had been empty, and there was no way someone could have slipped in without us noticing. Then there was the other problem. Whoever was sending these texts didn't need to be physically inside. They had somehow gotten to us through the dark web. They knew where we were, knew what we were doing, even seemed to predict our every move. I couldn't handle the silence any longer. I grabbed a broomstick from behind the kitchen counter and nudged Ben. "Okay, we'll open it together. If anyone's in there, we're not going in blind." Ben hesitated, then nodded, his hands trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He looked at me, waiting for my signal. I took a deep breath, gripping the broom like it would actually protect us. "Now," I whispered. Ben yanked open the door, and I braced myself for something, anything to come bursting out. But the closet was empty. Nothing. No person, no intruder, just a stack of boxes we hadn't unpacked yet. The air inside the closet was cold, unnaturally so, but nothing else seemed out of place. For a moment, relief washed over me. I had half expected to see some deranged figure crouching in the darkness, but there was nothing. "See?" Ben said, trying to laugh it off. "Nothing. We're freaking out over nothing." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But there was something off about the whole situation, something I couldn't shake. As I stepped closer to the closet, I noticed something odd on the floor. A piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting just inside the closet. My pulse quickened as I crouched down to pick it up. It wasn't ours. I hadn't seen it before. I unfolded it, my hands shaking. There were 2 words written in neat, blocky handwriting. "Look up." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Ben saw the paper and backed away from the closet, his eyes wide. "What the hell does that mean?" he whispered, fear creeping into his voice. I didn't respond. My heart pounded in my ears as I slowly, reluctantly, tilted my head back. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the ceiling, with the same light fixture we had installed a few days ago. But then, just above the door frame, I saw it. A small black device, tucked into the corner of the ceiling, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A camera. Someone had installed a hidden camera in our closet. Ben followed my gaze and swore under his breath. What the... When did that get there? I reached up and carefully removed the camera, holding it in my hand like it was something toxic. My mind raced, trying to figure out how long it had been there. Who had put it there? How had we not noticed? And then, the real horror set in. They had been watching us, this whole time. I threw the camera on the floor, smashing it with the broomstick. Ben grabbed his phone, frantically trying to get a signal, but nothing was working. Every time he tried to call, the line cut off. It was like we were completely cut off from the outside world. My phone buzzed again. That was a mistake. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. We had triggered something. This wasn't just some sick prank anymore. Someone or something was actively watching, controlling, manipulating us. They knew every move we made, and now they were angry. Ben's phone buzzed too, and he cursed under his breath. "Same message," he said, his voice shaking. Before I could say anything, the lights in the apartment flickered. The room was suddenly bathed in an eerie, dim glow, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and move on their own. The air grew colder, like a freezer door had been opened, and then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the closet, it was coming from inside the walls. I stared at Ben, my mouth dry, my heart pounding. "What do we do?" "I don't know," he whispered, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't know." The knocking grew louder, more frantic, moving from one wall to the next, like something, or someone, was trapped behind the drywall, trying to get out. Suddenly, all the lights went out. We were plunged into complete darkness. I couldn't see Ben, couldn't even hear him over the sound of my own heart beating in my ears. The apartment was pitch black, and the only sound was the relentless pounding in the walls, faster and more aggressive with each passing second. I fumbled for my phone, trying to use its screen as a light. The glow barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough to see the faint outline of Ben, standing frozen in place. "Jason," he whispered, "they're inside." And that's when I saw it. A shadow, moving in the darkness, barely visible. It wasn't human. Its form was twisted, unnatural, like it was bending reality itself. It moved slowly, deliberately, creeping toward us from the far corner of the room. My phone buzzed one last time, and the message sent a wave of terror through me. "You're next." I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs refused to move. All I could do was watch as the shadow grew closer, its form shifting and distorting with every step. And then, just as it reached us, the knocking stopped. The room fell into a silence so complete, it was deafening. But we knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence in the room was suffocating, thicker than the darkness that had swallowed everything. I didn't dare move, barely even breathed. Whatever had been knocking was still here, lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting for us to make the next wrong move. I could feel Ben beside me, motionless, probably feeling the same fear gnawing at his gut. I squinted through the gloom, trying to make sense of the shadow I'd seen before the lights went out. My mind was still spinning, struggling to grasp how any of this was happening. The Ouija board, the dark web, the camera, none of it made sense. Yet here we were, caught in a nightmare that felt way too real. Ben finally broke the silence, his voice barely audible. What do we do now?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't know, man." I glanced down at my phone, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the walls. No new messages, just that last one burned into my mind. "You're next." Suddenly the lights flickered back on, buzzing faintly like they were struggling to stay lit. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. like maybe this was over. Maybe the nightmare had passed. But when I looked around the room, that hope quickly faded. Nothing had changed. The shadows still seemed too long, too dark. The air was still thick with an oppressive weight, and there was this strange sense of being watched. My eyes drifted toward the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there again. But it was empty. "We need to get out of here," Ben said, his voice rising in panic. "This isn't safe. I don't know what's happening, but we need to leave." He wasn't wrong. Everything in me screamed to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I had this horrible feeling that it wouldn't matter. Whatever had started, whatever had targeted us, wasn't going to just let us walk away. I stood up, grabbing my keys from the table. "Okay, we'll go, but we stick together." Ben nodded, already halfway to the door. The sense of urgency was real now. We didn't have time to overthink it. But just as Ben reached for the doorknob, something happened that made my heart stop. The doorknob turned on its own. Ben jerked his hand back, eyes wide with terror. I could see the panic flooding his face, the same fear that was clawing at my insides. The door creaked open, just an inch, enough to reveal the dark hallway beyond. No one stood there, no intruder, just emptiness. "Ben, back up," I whispered, moving closer to him, my mind screaming that this was wrong. As the door slowly swung open, a rush of cold air flooded the room. It felt unnatural, like something had come in with the wind. We both took a step back, the lights flickering again, casting strange, distorted shadows across the walls. The darkness outside felt alive, almost like it was trying to reach into the apartment. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. Every fibre of my being told me to put it down, to leave it behind. But my fingers moved on their own, and I checked the message. "You can't run." My heart pounded against my ribs, the sheer weight of the words settling in. I looked at Ben, who had seen the text over my shoulder. His face had gone pale, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. It didn't matter if we left. They would find us, whatever they were. Suddenly, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway beyond the door. Slow, measured. Someone, or something, was approaching. I felt my breath catch in my throat as Ben slowly backed away from the door, his eyes wide with terror. "We can't stay here," he whispered, barely able to speak. "We've got to go." I nodded, but my body felt frozen. Those footsteps, they were getting closer, but they didn't sound right. They were too heavy, too deliberate, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't human. We made a split-second decision. Instead of running toward the door, we bolted for the back window in the living room. It led to the fire escape, and that seemed like our only option. Ben was already at the window, yanking it open with shaking hands. I followed, adrenaline surging through my veins, driving me forward. We climbed out into the night air, the fire escape rattling under our weight. I looked down. It was at least 3 stories to the ground, but there was no time to hesitate. Ben was already making his way down the metal ladder, and I followed close behind. The cold night air slapped me in the face, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of there, away from whatever was stalking us. But as I descended the ladder, I glanced up and froze. There, leaning out of the window we had just climbed through, was a figure. I couldn't make out its face. It was shrouded in darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its form bending in unnatural ways. I nearly slipped, my hands trembling as I gripped the ladder. "Ben!" I hissed. "Go faster!" We hit the ground running. I didn't even look back to see if the figure was following. I didn't want to know. We tore through the alley behind the apartment, our footsteps echoing off the walls, the only sound in the cold night. We finally stopped at a nearby convenience store, ducking inside the bright, fluorescent-lit space like it was some kind of sanctuary. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my breathing ragged. I collapsed against one of the shelves, trying to catch my breath. Ben was standing by the counter, talking to the cashier, probably asking if we could use their phone to call the police. But I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't matter. Whoever or whatever was after us wasn't going to be stopped by the police. I pulled out my phone again, half expecting another message. My hands trembled as I unlocked the screen. Nothing. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe, just maybe, we had gotten away. Maybe we were safe. But as I looked up, something in the corner of the store caught my eye. A security camera. The small black dome was mounted near the ceiling, aimed directly at the front counter, and below it, near the register, was a small monitor showing the live feed. I glanced at the screen, and my blood ran cold. The live feed showed me and Ben standing in the store, but there was something wrong. There was another figure standing between us, a tall, dark shape with those same unnatural, twisted limbs. But when I looked around the store, there was no one there. I blinked, staring at the screen. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, towering over us, its face still hidden in shadow. And then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its head and looked directly into the camera. My phone buzzed. "We see you." I dropped my phone, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing through the quiet store. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind was blank, consumed by a single overwhelming thought. We were never getting out of this. They were everywhere. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. That thing, whatever it was still staring straight at the camera. It was standing between us, close enough that we should have felt it, should have heard it. But there was nothing. Just that distorted shape on the security feed, looming over us like it belonged there. Ben was still talking to the cashier, completely unaware. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I was seeing. Was it real? Was this another game, another twisted part of the nightmare we had stumbled into? I wanted to shout, to tell Ben what I was seeing, but my voice wouldn't come. I was frozen, paralyzed by the figure on the screen, the way its shadow seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally, like it wasn't bound by the laws of reality. The door to the convenience store chimed as someone else walked in. I glanced up, my heart pounding, half expecting the figure from the security feed to be standing there in front of me. But it was just a man, bundled up in a heavy coat, heading toward the counter. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. Maybe the security feed was glitching. Maybe the stress was getting to me. But then the man, the customer, stopped halfway to the counter. His body went rigid, like he had just walked into something invisible. Slowly, he turned his head, looking directly at me with wide, terrified eyes. He saw it too. The lights in the store flickered, buzzing loudly. The air seemed to grow thick, oppressive, like something was closing in on us. Ben noticed it too, his conversation with the cashier cutting off abruptly. He looked over at me, then back at the man standing in the aisle, frozen in place. "Jason," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening?" Before I could answer, the man in the coat collapsed. He hit the floor hard, his body convulsing, his eyes rolled back into his head. The cashier screamed, rushing around the counter to help him, but I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to the security screen, where the shadowy figure was now directly in front of me, towering over the aisle. I could feel it, not physically, but in my mind. It was like my thoughts weren't my own anymore, like something was crawling into my head, pulling at the edges of my consciousness, trying to find a way in. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't need to check it. I already knew what it would say. It's time. The lights went out. The entire store was plunged into darkness, the buzzing fluorescent lights dying all at once. The hum of the coolers in the back stopped, and for a second, the silence was absolute. The only sound was my own breathing, ragged and panicked, echoing in the pitch-black room. And then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing off the tile floor. They didn't belong to the cashier or Ben, or even the customer who had collapsed. These footsteps were heavier, deeper, like something massive was walking through the store, its presence pressing down on everything. I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up with a pale glow, casting just enough light to see a few feet in front of me. I scanned the room, searching for Ben, but he was gone. The counter, the aisles, all empty. It was like I was the only one left. The footsteps grew closer, louder, each one sending a jolt of fear through my body. I could feel it approaching, that thing, the figure I had seen on the security feed. I could feel it in the air, the cold, heavy dread that filled every corner of the room. I backed up slowly, my phone the only source of light, my hand trembling as I held it out in front of me. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever it was had gone. But then I heard it. A voice. Faint, barely a whisper. But there. It didn't come from the air around me. It came from inside my head. A low, rasping voice, like it was speaking directly into my thoughts. "You can't hide." I spun around, aiming the phone light toward the back of the store, but there was nothing. Just rows of shelves, empty and dark. But the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "We've been watching you. We've always been watching." I stumbled backward, my mind racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The air felt thick, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The voice twisted in my head, bending my thoughts, pulling at my fear. "You opened the door. You let us in." And then I saw it. In the far corner of the store, just at the edge of the light from my phone, the figure appeared. Its form was a mass of shadows, constantly shifting and bending, its limbs too long, its body too tall. It stood there, watching me, its hollow eyes boring into me. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, rooted to the floor. All I could do was stare as it slowly, impossibly, began to stretch toward me, its twisted limbs reaching out like tendrils of darkness, creeping closer with every passing second. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt like it had closed up, my body refusing to respond. The shadow was right in front of me now, its form towering over me, blotting out everything else. The voice whispered one last time, cold and final. "We see everything." And then the lights flickered back on. The store was empty. No shadow, no figure, no Ben. Just me, standing alone in the middle of the convenience store, my phone buzzing faintly in my hand. I looked down at the screen. "You can never leave." I don't know how long I stood there staring at the phone. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. They had found me. They had always been watching. And now, no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, they would always be there, watching.